Hey, RetconRaider here, and welcome back to Fallout Van Buren. As usual, it's just an excuse to dust off my notes, do some more research, and spend some more time chatting about a Fallout game that, sadly, we'll never get to play. Not as originally envisioned, at least. Honestly, even if it had made it to launch, Van Buren itself wouldn't have been as it was originally envisioned by Chris Avellone. As with many games, Van Buren went through several revisions throughout its development, something which is reflected in the often inconsistent or sometimes outright conflicting design documents. In its earliest iteration, the main story, designed as a tabletop role-playing campaign by Chris Avellone, was significantly more expansive than the revised and stripped-down version that was being worked on by the time Interplay finally officially pulled the plug. Numerous locations were cut or combined. Major plot elements such as Caesar's Legion and Robot City were minimized or dropped entirely. Even the main story arc surrounding Presper was significantly reimagined. Sadly, it would take far too much time to go over all of these elements in a single video, but today we're going to touch on one of them. Well, technically we'll be touching on more than just one of them, but, well, you'll see. Of course, before we get into that, I should take a quick moment to thank the Raiders, the fine folks who help make these videos possible. So, special thanks to Revenant, Alois, Anerdinwarpaint, Dragon Matrix 7, Exsellsior, Gottlieb, Kazorm, Lima, Nathan Welch Jr., Tomasz Piątkowski, Triphoppenskip, and Valinrook. Thanks for your support, guys. That said, let's get started. Now today, we are going to talk about Circle Junction, one of the very first casualties of Van Buren's troubled development cycle. In fact, it was cut from development so early that it never even got a proper design document. Instead, almost all of the information we have about this location comes from fragmented notes from Chris Avallone's original tabletop campaign, plus a few later revisions tacked on by Josh Sawyer. At its most basic, Circle Junction was an old-world railroad switchyard, the part of a rail network where train cars are stored, repaired, loaded, and switched onto different tracks. The main features would have been 3 main tracks running through the location from east to west, which the local inhabitants called the 3 Great Roads. The most prominent feature was a massive circular railway turntable, which they called the Great Circle. These were flanked on either side by old railway buildings and abandoned train cars, which had been repurposed as homes for the current inhabitants. Geographically, the design documents mention that Circle Junction was near Boulder Dome in Denver, which would place it on the very northeast corner of the map. Avallone's notes helped narrow this down even further, and it was most likely intended to go about here, at the fork in the rails between Boulder and Denver. This matches up with many of the other details, with the eastward tracks leading to Fort Leavenworth back in Kansas, and the westward tracks leading through the mountain ranges and out towards Fort Abandon. The northwestern offshoot track would lead to Boulder Dome, and a broken stretch of track would lead south into the ruins of Denver. The player could appeal to the inhabitants of Circle Junction to help repair those broken tracks, easing travel and facilitating trade. The inhabitants were a primitive tribe known as the Iron Rivers, or possibly the Iron Lines, but we'll come back to that a little later. First, let's go over the basics. Near as I can figure, the tribes had originally hailed from somewhere far to the southeast, most likely the Kansas Badlands. They had struggled for survival until the fateful day that they spotted a train traveling along the tracks leading to Circle Junction. Although they had long since lost sight of the train itself, they followed the tracks in its wake, eventually stumbling onto the pre-war switchyard. Lacking the knowledge to understand what they were looking at, they instead ended up mythologizing the old rail network, weaving the trains and tracks into a new post-apocalyptic mythos. The main tracks became the Great Metal Roads, with the broken tracks labeled as dire skeleton tracks. Those led to places of ill omen, such as the ruins of Denver, which they described as a place where glass ladders touched the sky, with dogs always biting at their foundations. The turntable became known as the Great Circle, and apparently weighed heavily into their new mythology. The chief and his son had both adopted similar names, Big Circle and Little Circle respectively. The train that had led them here, the Great Roaring Machine, was deified, proclaimed as a sign that the old world was reawakening, and the tracks that it left in its wake would serve to guide the tribe to more fruitful hunting grounds. Similarly, the local threats were mythologized as well. Rad scorpions were a common sight, and the largest of them was known to the tribe as Mad King Scorpion. Feral ghouls also roamed the area, once members of chain gangs that had worked along the tracks. They had since been dubbed Chain Walkers by the tribe, due to the broken handcuffs and manacles that they still wore. According to Avalon, the Iron Rivers had once been part of a much larger tribe, but they had split sometime before or after the discovery of Circle Junction. He leaves it rather vague. One part of that tribe, the Iron Rivers, settled in the boxcars scattered in and around the switchyard, while the other group traveled farther west and settled somewhere else. Details of this second tribe are almost non-existent beyond a brief mention in Avalon's notes, and the suggestion that the player could gain an experience reward for somehow reuniting these two now ostracized tribes. The Iron Rivers are described as primitive but talented scouts and outdoorsmen. They lack the technological know-how to understand or repair anything more complex than rail handcars, but they're quite capable when it comes to crafting goods from Brahmin or dog leather. Josh Sawyer provides some additional details about the Circle Junction tribals as well. In his short-lived Fallout tabletop RPG project, he further describes them as using salvaged handcars to explore and map out the tracks throughout the region. He describes them as being nomadic and traveling in handcar caravans for mutual safety. He also mentions that they decorate their bodies with parallel lines, resembling the tracks that they would travel upon. Curiously, Sawyer's description, although fascinating, doesn't seem to quite match up with Avalon's original description of the Iron Rivers. In fact, Sawyer even refers to them by a different name, the Iron Lines. There are some interesting implications here, but the simplest explanation is that Josh Sawyer was simply describing the group from memory and couldn't remember their original name. His tabletop RPG project was a couple of years after Van Buren had already been cancelled. While he did initially indicate that the Iron Lines were intended to be the tribals from Circle Junction, he later deferred questions about it to Chris Avalon instead. I do have some fun speculation about that, but we'll circle back around to it towards the end of the video. For now, let's just get back to the basic stuff. Okay, so from a story standpoint, Avalon left the background of the Iron Rivers unusually vague. There's no detailed timeline aside from a description of very recent events, most of which are directly tied to the player's escape from Fort Leavenworth at the very beginning of the campaign. Now, I should stress that this is, of course, based on Avalon's original, more expansive vision for the game. At this early point in the pre-production stage, Fort Leavenworth was still around. It was the prison that the player would first wake up in. Leavenworth is a real location in Kansas, and it would have been hundreds of miles outside the eventual planned world map, far to the east of Denver and Circle Junction. Big MT was likewise still around, a separate location that was further west, likely near where the Tibbetts prison facility was eventually placed. Additionally, at this early stage in development, Caesar's Legion was still planned to be one of the numerous threats that the player would eventually have to contend with. While they were based somewhere far to the west, either around the Grand Canyon or even deeper into Arizona, their slaving parties would range out as far east as Denver and Circle Junction. These early encounters were intended to give the player a brief taste of what was to come when they eventually ventured further west. So, with that in mind, let's go through the series of events that Avalon laid out in his original vision for the beginning of the campaign. First, of course, the player would be introduced as an accused criminal locked up in Black Canyon, a prison and work camp run by the NCR. They would go to sleep in Black Canyon, but then wake up in a completely different prison, Fort Leavenworth. The exact details of how this happened are vague, but the general implications are that Presper would have deliberately infected several prisoners at Black Canyon with the new plague, and then deliberately taken them to Fort Leavenworth as part of his efforts to infiltrate the pre-war facility. Much like Tibbetts, Fort Leavenworth was intended to be an AI-controlled pre-war military prison, and the artificial intelligence running it, Ulysses, was under orders to arrest and detain anyone infected with the new plague, likely a holdover from when the plague was still running rampant in the days leading up to the Great War. Presper would have also deliberately infected himself and possibly some of his men, so that they would be arrested alongside the rest of the prisoners, and by sheer coincidence, both he and the player would be placed in Cell Block 13. Presper would use his genius and unparalleled knowledge of old world technology to escape his cell, free his men, and recover some sort of plot device from the depths of Fort Leavenworth. Afterwards, he and his men would commandeer a pre-war military train, the General, before signaling a second group of Presper's men to breach the external walls of the prison with high explosives. By sheer coincidence, this would also blast open Cell Block 13, allowing the player and 6 other prisoners to escape in the ensuing chaos. Presper and his men would load into the General and flee west towards Circle Junction, and shortly afterwards Ulysses would dispatch a second train, El Loco, in hot pursuit. The player and the other escapees would scatter, traveling on foot back towards more familiar territory, and the player would eventually arrive near Circle Junction, ready to begin the campaign proper. Now, before the player's arrival, several events would have taken place in relatively rapid succession. First, Circle Junction had been recently attacked by a band of 50 to 60 slavers from Caesar's Legion. They had easily overpowered the primitive Iron Rivers tribe, capturing or killing most of them, but a small group of tribals had managed to escape and flee southeast to the Kansas Badlands. The slavers set up a temporary base camp on the 3 great roads in Circle Junction as they prepared for the long journey back west with their newly acquired slaves. Then, roughly 2 days prior to the player's arrival, Presper and his men literally crashed onto the scene. Still fleeing from Leavenworth, their train smashed through the Legion slave camp before pulling to a stop at the Great Turntable. They fought off the angry slavers long enough to rotate the turntable and connect it to the northwestern track, the one leading to Boulder Dome, and then made good their escape. Several of the tribals captured during the Legion's initial attack would escape during the fray, heading southeast to join the rest of their tribe. They would sing praises to the god machine that had miraculously freed them from captivity, and they would also sing praises to the mysterious Tribe of 13 that had been riding upon the machine, in reference to the Cell Block 13 prison uniforms that Presper and his men were still wearing. Back at Circle Junction, most of the surviving slavers quickly formed an attack party and would set off after Presper's train. Only a few would remain behind, the wounded and a small skeleton crew, to guard the remaining captives and ward off additional attacks. Then, about an hour after Presper had passed through, El Loco would also burst onto the scene. Unlike the General, however, El Loco would almost immediately derail, likely because the turntable was no longer aligned with the main tracks. The train would be totally wrecked, but a massive metal spider would emerge from that wreckage and set off along the main tracks to the west. Stupefied and terrified by the sight, the remaining slavers would do nothing to stop it. This would set the stage for the player's arrival. They would first encounter the escaped members of the tribe southeast of Circle Junction, who would recognize the player's jumpsuit and assume that they were also a member of the mysterious Tribe of 13. Treating the player as a friend and ally, they would give them a mythologized version of recent events and warn them about the slavers who still occupied Circle Junction. At this point, the player would be more or less free to proceed as they saw fit. They would need to secure a functional train or handcar to pass through the mountains to the west, but both could potentially be found at Union Station in the ruins of Denver. Ultimately, this trifecta of starting locations were carefully designed to ease the player into the game, giving them the opportunity to get some loot and levels under their belt while simultaneously introducing them to the game's various major plot points. They would learn about Caesar's Legion in Circle Junction and about the NCR's recent troubles from the scavengers in Denver. Traveling to Boulder would likewise give the player a primer on the perils of the new plague, while simultaneously cementing Presper as a major player in the overarching plotline. The confrontation would also provide them with potential clues as to what the Mad Doctor was trying to accomplish and where he was headed next. Likewise, if the players rescued the remaining tribals in Circle Junction, they would also learn about the metal spider that had emerged from El Loco, which is likely an early iteration of Argos, the massive mechanical enforcer sent to recover the Leavenworth escapees. From a gameplay standpoint, Circle Junction was likely intended to present the player with their first serious combat encounter of the game. Only a small number of slavers had stayed behind, and some of them were wounded, which would give the player a relatively easy source of early game equipment and experience points. This encounter would also introduce the element of time-sensitive events, something which would be a recurring theme throughout the campaign. In this particular case, the attack party would eventually tire of chasing Presper and return to Circle Junction. If the player hadn't already rescued the remaining captives by then, it would suddenly become a much more daunting task. If the player continued dragging their feet even after that, then eventually the slavers would opt to just cut their losses, packing up and leaving with the remaining captives, thus depriving the player of not just loot and XP, but also valuable information. Regardless of whether or not the player ended up freeing the remaining captives, the rest of the tribe would still provide other valuable services. The player would be able to learn about the region from NPCs like Long Walk, a rambling storyteller who would provide valuable info, couched in the tribe's homegrown mythology. The tribe would also introduce the player to the basics of the game's new crafting system, and provide them with partial maps of the game's rail network. If the player appealed to the tribe's faith, they could convince the Iron Rivers to help with repairing the skeleton tracks leading into Denver. This would allow the player to retrieve a salvageable train at the Denver Union Station, and ease travel and trade between Denver and Boulder Dome. This would also make it much easier to transport building materials from Denver to other parts of the world map for various other major construction projects, such as repairing or restoring stretches of track, or building up player outposts at Fort Abandon, Hoover Dam, and the Bloomfield Space Center. The Iron Rivers would have even offered a potential early game companion, Alkaya, a skilled scout and outdoorsman who could also craft basic items for the player. She was planned as one of at least 7 potential early game companions, but sadly, she was one of the very first things cut from development after early playtesters deemed her largely useless. Thankfully, the player would still be able to acquire potential companions in both of the other nearby locations. Now, sadly, that is pretty much everything we know about Avalon's original plans for Circle Junction. Still, it does paint quite a vivid picture of how he originally envisioned the early stages of the game playing out. Something which I've long puzzled over, since in later iterations the player's starting point was moved to Tibbet's prison facility, right near the middle of the map. That would have dropped the player right next to several higher-level locations, making it difficult to figure out exactly how the player was intended to progress. Having studied the available info on Circle Junction, however, it's now much clearer that the original intent was for the player to begin tucked away in the northeast corner of the world map, where the lowest level threats are all conveniently clustered together. Threat levels would then scale higher and higher as the player progressed farther south and west. Of course, with Circle Junction being one of the earliest casualties of the iterative design process, they would have needed to completely reimagine those early stages of the game. While Denver and Boulder were still relatively low-level areas, they were now halfway across the map from the player's new starting position, roughly 200 miles away. Instead of Circle Junction, the first location the player was now likely to stumble across was Fort Abandon. Or was it? That actually brings us to one last bit of rather intriguing speculation, something that might help explain the odd discrepancies between Avalon and Sawyer's descriptions of the tribe at Circle Junction. In an interview, Josh Sawyer indicated that at the point he left development, they were apparently considering cutting Fort Abandon and instead putting Circle Junction in its place. It would have been a logical decision, since it would now occupy a central crossroad right at the center of the game's planned rail and trade routes. It would still be the first location that the player was likely to come across after the game's introduction, and it would allow the developers to keep most of Avalon's original early game story beats intact, though they would need to be adjusted to reflect that Denver and Boulder Dome were now roughly 200 miles away. This could explain why Sawyer's write-up about the Iron Lines differed so much from Avalon's. As written, Avalon described a largely stationary tribe that was settled in rail cars in and around Circle Junction, while Sawyer described them as being nomadic, traveling along the railways in handcart caravans. This would make sense, given that the new central location would give the tribe access to numerous extra tracks to explore. Perhaps more tellingly, though, Sawyer described the Iron Lines as being at odds with Hecate and her minions, which wouldn't make much sense with Circle Junction's original placement. Hecate and the Vipers were located at Ouroboros and Mesa Verde, respectively, almost 200 miles from Denver, and on the opposite side of multiple mountain ranges. Moving Circle Junction to the center of the map would plot the tribe right in the middle of Hecate's territory, and making the Iron Lines more nomadic would easily help explain why they had been relatively unaffected by Hecate's mysterious curses. In reality, these curses were just genetically engineered bioweapons that Hecate used to poison the land of tribes who defied her will, something which would be far less effective against a tribe that largely survived with wide-ranging hunts all along the sprawling railways. This would also easily explain why the Vipers would try to kill any Iron Lines tribals they encountered, because it was the only way Hecate could punish them for defying her will. Of course, that would come at the cost of losing whatever content was planned for Fort Abandon, but it's hard to really compare the two, since that's another location we sadly don't have a design document for. The main thing we do know about Fort Abandon is that it was where the player would first meet Joshua Graham, the Hanged Man, perhaps better known as the Burned Man, as he was called in Fallout New Vegas. Given that most of the other Mormon and Legion-related content had already been trimmed out of the game by the point where both Avalon and Sawyer had left the project, it's possible that the intent was to remove Joshua Graham as well, with plans to eventually reintroduce him in what was intended to be a more Legion-focused sequel, the original Fallout 4. Another intriguing, if more far-fetched theory, is that the Iron Lines and the Iron Rivers were deliberately intended to be two separate tribes, both hailing from Circle Junction. After all, in his original notes, Avalon had indicated that the Iron Rivers had split into two separate tribes, with one moving farther west. In that case, perhaps the intent was for the Iron Rivers to remain in their original position near Denver, while the Iron Lines would be a more nomadic tribe, found on the tracks out west. Perhaps reuniting the two was intended to be an integral step towards mapping out and repairing the railways throughout the entire region. Sadly, short of Avalon himself coming out and confirming it for us, there's no way to know if that's even remotely accurate. Still, it is fun to imagine how all these disparate bits and bobs, these fragmented notes, were ultimately supposed to fit together. At any rate, that's just about everything on the docket for today. We've still got Bomb 1 and possibly New Canaan to chat about in the future, plus a few other odds and ends, but we've almost reached the finish line. Feel free to share your thoughts about Circle Junction or Van Buren in general, or even what you might like to see me dig into next. But for now, this is RetconRaider, signing off. Thanks for listening. Oh, and remember, while I do love talking about Fallout Van Buren, you can check out the design documents for yourself by visiting the fan-run Fallout Wiki. And if you'd like to help support the channel, then feel free to push the buttons that do the things, or maybe even check out the Patreon. As always, links are in the description.